Hello my tarot friends, it's Justin Michael. Welcome back to my channel, and of course welcome if it's your first time visiting. I appreciate you stop by as always. In this video it's going to be part 2 of a video series I started last week, and hopefully there's going to be a few more. On historic cards, we looked at the decks from Paris in the 17th century. So we looked at the Viville, and we looked at the Anonymous Tarot of Paris, and we also looked at a little bit at the Jean Noblet. In this video, we're going to look at the Belgium Tarot, or what I always thought was the Belgium Tarot, but it's more known to be the Rouen Brussels Pattern. And it's sort of what brought me into Viville. I started researching this because I became very interested in the Belgium decks, or what I thought was the Belgium pattern. But it actually originates in France, and I never knew this, but the Hautot, or the Hautot, the Adam C. de Hautot, originates from the Rouen region of France. I never knew that. I just didn't. It never occurred to me. I always thought it was a Belgium deck. And, you know, of course, when you learn things, you realize you were ignorant about certain things. And it's just very interesting. And so this deck here is the Vandenborre. It's the first Belgium deck that I ever became acquainted with. There are a few more, but this is the only one I have. I have the Cartamundi version. And it's often called the Bacchus Tarot, or the Tarot of Flamand. And it came with a little white book, which is complete nonsense, because the very first page talks about B.P. Grimaud in 1748 inventing Tarot de Marseille, and we know that's just not true. And so that was very common back then. They would just make shit up about the cards, and so I didn't really read that book much. But this is the Cartamundi version of the Vandenborre. There is a Vandenborre by Pablo Robledo. There's one in the British Museum that I love that has like these really beautiful greens, very close to what we see in the Francois Gassman. This is the Adam C. de Hautot, recreated by Sullivan Hissman, which was a very huge thing, because it was always an incomplete deck. You know, when Dummett talked about it, it was incomplete. But Sullivan was able to redraw this, and he used multiple decks, and he didn't have to invent anything. And it's really a beautiful deck. It's one of my most prized possessions in terms of historic decks. I just absolutely love it. And it comes in this beautiful paper envelope, which is just incredible. And so when I first read about this in Dummett's book, he actually thought that it was a 17th century deck. You know, he didn't realize it. We now say it's more likely to have been made in 23 is the date that they come up with. The reason that changed is because they found out later that the Au Cour Royal insignia, or the signature, was associated with the date 1723. It has to do with that in some kind of, you know, in the record books or whatever, wherever documentation they found that. Michael Dummett talks about this deck, and he says visually it looks very 17th century, you know. And so there was a whole bunch of Adam C. de Hautots in Rouen in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century that they couldn't figure out which one it came from. It must have been a big family or just a common name or whatever, but there were a ton of them. And so Dummett looks at the deck, and he says, well, it has these borders, which is very similar to the Anonymous Tarot of Paris, and it just has a very 17th century look, so it must fit in with you know, this card maker from, you know, the 1650s to early 1700s. This is what he thought. It was like that kind of reasoning. He knew that there was a potential to be wrong. It wasn't known for certain, but now we know, probably in the age of the internet and all these other things, that we were able to you know, match up the Au Cour Royal with the date 1723. That's probably more accurate, but who knows? It might not be. I mean, we just don't know. So these are the two Belgium decks I'm going to be looking at. This is the Viville, of course, by my friend Shell David, and then the Anonymous Tarot of Paris. I'm going to be using these more as a reference, because the 4 decks, believe it or not, even though it's called the Belgium Tarot, they have a lot in common. They have you know, some common ancestry and symbolism in there, and I'm going to point that out, and hopefully you're going to see by the end of the video that, you know, the Belgium Tarot is very much a French tarot, and that, you know, they all are very, very related. Tarot started becoming popular in the 16th century in France. It started being taxed in like the last couple of decades of the 16th century. So like 1583, I think was the first big tax thing, and then all in the early 1600s, there were a whole bunch of new tax laws, and Rouen was one of the top producers of tarot at that time, along with Leon. They were the two top producers, and they often competed. And the reason we know that is because of the tax legislation. In Rouen, for instance, they were heavily taxed, but it seems that they were able to overturn the taxes in some case, and the same thing happened in Leon, but ultimately they were crushed with taxes again, and this is long before Marseille produced cards. We think of Tarot de Marseille today because it's based on the pattern that came about in the 18th century. This is before that. Marseille wasn't really producing decks at this time, so it was Paris, Rouen, and Leon, and places like that. And then as time went by, of course, tarot got more popular and more cities started producing it. And they were all heavily taxed. In each case where I look into the taxes, tarot was often taxed twice that of regular playing cards. So, and I couldn't figure out why that was. So, like for instance, playing cards would be taxed at 1 so in Rouen, which is like I don't know, it's 12 denier or something. So 1 so for playing cards, 2 so for tarot. It was double, and I couldn't figure out why that was. I wanted to, establish, was it a stigma that was attached to tarot that made the taxes high, or was it as simple as just more cards and more paper? And I think that's the case. I think tarot was extremely popular in France at this time, and there's one Jesuit priest that's quoted as saying, in the late 1500s, that tarot was more popular than chess in France. It was extremely popular. So it could have been popularity that made the taxes higher, or at least added to that. But it was probably the paper, because you have 78 cards versus like 52 or whatever it was for playing cards. And then they're also larger, so it's twice the paper, and that's what it looks like. So that's pretty much it, like with the tax history. It's just a good indication of how popular the cards were, and it gives us some idea of where the cards were produced. So to give you an idea of Rouen, where this was produced, how popular they were, they produced what we now know as the Anglo-American playing card pattern, like the spades and hearts and all that we see in America. That originated in Rouen, and so it spread to England, and then of course subsequently the United States from that. And in a similar way, Dummett argues in his book that tarot, this pattern, what we call the Rouen Brussels pattern, spread from Rouen or even Paris to Belgium because they were imported there. They were exported there rather. And so most of the countries like that Rouen exported cards to was like England and the Low Countries. So Belgium was on that list. But you also had massive waves of immigration, card makers leaving and going to places. So tarot spread in so many different ways. There's no way to know exactly where it came from. But I think Dummett's main point, and this is going to be the focus of this video, is that this pattern, which we now know as the Rouen Brussels pattern, originated in France, likely Paris or Rouen, And you're going to see that these 4 decks have a lot in common, and they're all related. Okay, so you can see the magicians in these 3 decks are very, very similar. Very different here. The only thing that you see with the Hautot and the anonymous Tarot of Paris is the border, and it's very, very close. Aside from the inner part there, if you look at the checkered border, it looks very, very similar. And if that were the only thing that I noticed, or that it had in common, I would say, it's probably a common border. It's a checkered border. It's probably very common. This one has a different border, and so does the Vaville. But that's just something interesting. And then of course it has the same title, but other than that, you're looking at it, they look very different. And that's That's the thing we see with the Anonymous Tarot of Paris. It's it's kind of a quirky, odd deck that doesn't really fit in with any of these other ones in any direct way. Okay, so again, Viville, Hautot, this is Vandenborre, and this is Paris. So now we have the Papess, okay? So you have a traditional Papess, which you would see in like later the Tarot de Marseille, and same here, La Papesse, no title in the Viville. But in these two, you have this character, the Spanish captain, L'Espagnol, Capitano Francesi, in the Hautot, and then in the Vandenborre, it's Capitano Ericassi. So it's very likely that the F was changed to an E, probably an engraver's error. And Dummett mentions in the book that this, and is very different. I mean, it's not seen anywhere else in any other pattern. You know, we have the Juno and Jupiter in the Besancons, and it was typical for card makers in Catholic areas to replace the Papess and the Pope because, you know, they didn't want to offend the church. But this looks like it came from, and this is Michael Dummett says this in his book, it comes from an engraving by Michael Lasna, which is in the 16th century at some time, 16th or 17th century. And so the Spanish captain likely comes from a character in what they call the Commedia dell'arte. I don't know too much about that other than, you know, that's where it comes from, and it's this type of theater, you know, and hopefully I'll explore that a little more eventually and learn more about that. But as of right now, that's all the information I have. But it comes from that engraving. Now we get to the Empress, and you're going to notice, first off, these three are very, very similar. And of course, the odd man out again is the Hautot. But what you'll notice in the Hautot is that the Empress is numbered 4 and not number 3. And so they were switched, and we don't know if that was an engraving error, but it could very well have been, you know, deliberate by Hautot. You know, that would just mean that the Empress in the game outranked the Emperor. You know, I switched them around because, you know, I was doing this walkthrough, but, you know, normally it would be the Emperor then the Empress. But all very similar otherwise, you know, which is very, very interesting. The Emperor, also very similar in these 3 decks. But aside from like little nuance differences, very, very same kind of tradition, you know. So here's the other character, and this is really interesting, and this kind of threw me for a loop as well, because, you know, when I read in Dummett's book that, you know, this deck, he was pretty confident that, you know, it was a French pattern, and it came from France and then migrated to Belgium. But I saw the Bacchus, and I wondered, you know, was this something that was made specifically for Belgium, you know, for export or something? Because I saw this, you know, in a chapboard. So there was a conversation, and someone mentioned the Bavarian tarot deck has the Bacchus character. And I personally have never seen this anywhere. And so I thought, well, Bavarian tarot deck, you know, maybe it has some roots in that kind of Germanic area, you know. But it's actually not. It's Roman. And the tarot deck didn't really, I think, come around until like the 18th or 19th century. I think the 19th century. So it might have well come from this even. But then there's another Bacchus character that is, this is the Marziano Tarot from Robert M. Place. And now I think Robert didn't have any visual source for this image. I think he got it from a book and then he drew it. He sort of invented it. And that's the Marziano Tarot. It's what he argues is the earliest tarot deck, you know, the Marziano Tarot. But it's very different from, you know, the type of tarot that we're talking about. You know, it does have trumps and pips, but it's in no way related to these, other than maybe it's an early ancestor. But it's not very, very similar. So I was trying to figure out, where did this Bacchus character come from? Was it something that existed in France? And then last night I was watching Versailles, which I've been into lately on Netflix. And in the opening part of it, there's a picture or an image of the Bacchus in the garden at Versailles. And I was like, wow. So obviously it was known in 17th century France, and I verified that, with Google. And apparently there's, I think, 2 statues of the Bacchus at Versailles. There's one in the fountain, and then there's also one in the garden. So yes, so Bacchus was known, and it goes back to like Greco-Roman stuff. Bacchus is the god of like euphoria and wine, and I think it's even Dionysus, is what people say. They link it to Dionysus, but it's a really cool character and just very different from Hierophant. Has like a very rebellious kind of nature, that the Hierophant doesn't have, and it just makes this deck really interesting and something I just really felt drawn to. The Lover's pretty similar across the board. In the Vandenborre, which again is a 1780 deck from Brussels, hopefully I mentioned that in the beginning, it has like a canopy or like an umbrella thing over the head of the lover, and whereas this has the bow and arrow, and then it's sort of missing, the bow and arrow is missing in the Vivial, but you do have an angel with a bow and arrow in the Tarot of Paris. So but other than that, I mean, it's very similar, and you can see there's sort of relations all throughout. Sometimes, it's not like the Vivial is a direct ancestor of this, and then this is a direct ancestor of this. There were probably many decks like this, And so now we have the Chariot, which in the Vivial we have more of what we see in Tarot de Marseille, in the Dodal and the Noblet. This is always very interesting with the human faces on the horses. But these two are totally different images. And it's just like a horse-drawn chariot. And in this, they're kind of facing the same way, but it's very different, but it's spelled the same and so forth. But it's closer to this than this is. I mean, at least symmetrically. So now we're in card 8, which is Justice, and this is another very interesting one. Okay. So Justice is in the Hautot, has wings, and then, but in the Vivial, it's a chairback, but it's a kind of, like oddly shaped chairback. Like, who knows if they were originally wings or originally a chairback? Like, we just don't know. I mean, to me, they look more like wings than a chairback. But in both of these, they're chairbacks. But in this, they've become wings. So, I mean, it's obviously, an engraver could look at that and say, okay, yeah, they're wings, And now we have the Hermit. And, okay, so you have the Vandenborre, the 1780 deck, and the Vivial, and they have sort of the same hand positions, and they're all 4 of them are monks, likely monks. But you have a book in his hand. This guy's doing like a completely different kind of stance, and yeah, it's interesting. And you have Le Hermit here. Same here. And of course, no title on the Vivial. The Vivial's titles actually exist on the aces. And if you watch my last walkthrough of the Vivial and, those decks, the Parisian decks, you will see that the ace of, I'll point it out to you in this as well, but all the majors are named in the Ace of Pentacles and the Two of Cups. So this one is also interesting. You have the Wheel of Fortune. The one that sort of stands out, they're all very, very similar, is the Hautot, which has a head on the wheel. They have like these 2 little animals. So like in this case, for instance, the Belgium Tarot is actually closer to this image, And now we have a card 11. We have Strength, where in the Vivial, now we know, as I pointed out in the last video, Veville was a different arrangement of trumps. So it's 9, but in the Parisian deck and Hautot and the Vandenborre, you have the standard kind of Tarot de Marseille, aside from the Emperor and the Empress in the Hautot, which have been switched. But it's generally the same arrangement, and the Veville just stands out because it's slightly different, But you can see the relation. Okay, so here's my absolute favorite, the Hangman. I absolutely love this Hangman. And there's some interesting things about this. So, with the Veville, if you look at the Hangman and the Veville, Dummett points this out in his book, and I never noticed it before. But if you turn it the other way, you can see there's like a fork up here that holds the stick where he's hanging, and you can see that the engraver intended this to be upside down more than likely, like otherwise it sort of defies that common sense, and so we don't know whether Veville intentionally turned this up because he was trying to match a tradition like this, or if he was the first to do it as a mistake and then the others sort of followed. I mean, who knows? I don't know of any other decks other than the Belgium decks and the Hautot where it has the inverted Hangman. I mean, I think there's one in Gabelon's decks or something. There's one, but my theory is that the engraver just put in the number at the last minute and it was upside down, So we don't really know. Could have been intentional, might not have been. But if you look at this Hangman here, there's no rope attaching his foot in the Hautot. You have a rope which looks like it was like penciled in, attaching the head to the top, but it doesn't really make much sense, but it's missing the rope. So that was intentional. I mean, you can see that was intentional, because the rope is missing. So there was a tradition where the Hangman was inverted. The Vandenborre does have the rope, but again, the title confirms that it was intentionally, the title and the number. The Tarot of Paris is very kind of traditional, Okay, so Death card, very interesting, and I love this one. The Hautot Death, I just love that skeleton. But I love all three of these in their own way, You have the flower, some details missing, but in this one you have some heads which are visible. Okay, so here's another piece of evidence linking the Hautot and the Belgium decks to the Tarot of Paris. This is like the second big piece of evidence that you can actually see, and that is the word for temperance is misspelled as a trempence, and it's also done in Hautot. It's spelled a temperance. So now we have the same border or similar border, very close, missing little details here and there, but now you have a trempence. So you're like, okay, there's something to it now. In the Belgium deck and the Vandenborre, it's spelled La Temperance, and of course not labeled in the Veville. Okay, so now we have the Devil, which again is that illustrious image that a lot of people just love. I really love it. My favorite, I think, is, I don't know, it's between the Veville and the Hautot. I don't know which one I like more. I like them both. This is sort of a friendly devil. He's like a beast, but I love the color. And my friend Shell David, he did such an amazing job as covering this. But they're all kind of cool, and very different here. And so now we have the La Foudre, which is in place of the tower. Is what we see in Tarot de Marseille. It's La Maison Deux. It's La Foudre, and just means lightning. And aside from a few details, these three are very, very close. Still called La Foudre here. And you know, you have some like lots of sheep and goats, whatever they are here, and just a couple here. And here you still have them. The droplets are the same in the Hautot as they are in the Viville. You know, they're very similar. And here it's like changed, it's different. Plus it has the lightning bolts kind of indicated there by the arrows. Really interesting card. Okay, so now we have the star. Spelled the same here and here. These, actually, the four of them are very similar. You know, you have the astronomer, or the figure with the compass, you know. And but these three are very close. I mean, you know. And you have the same kind of thing here with the little droplets there, you know. So now we have the moon. This one is just tough to really kind of make out what's going on in this. You got a guy playing the harp in the moonlight. I don't know what is going on here. I don't have the patience to kind of break that apart and figure out what's going on. But here, you know, you have another tree. Again, you have the droplets, which are very similar in both moons of the Viville and the Hautot. And this one is just a little different, but still very similar. You know, the moon's different. Okay, so now we have the sun. As usual, the Tarot of Paris is very different, but we have, you know, the same kind of symbolism in these three. You know, a boy riding a horse in the sun, which is a common image, you know, we see even in Rider-Waite-Smith now. So it's very, very interesting. Judgment is also very interesting. So in the Viville, it's actually called Le Trompe, or the trumpet. That's where it's spelled on one of the ace, I believe, or one of the cups. It's not called Judgment, but here it's called Le Judgment. In these three, with the labels. And the thing that always stands out to me is this little skeleton in the image. I just love that. And there's an added flag in these two. It's missing in the Hautot. Okay, so now here's number 3, Exhibit C of you know, the ancestral connection between the Tarot of Paris and the Belgium decks. You have the World card, and this is really drastic because in the Viville you have very close to what we see in the Tarot de Marseille, you know, but these three are very, very similar. It's the same character standing on the world, and then you even have these little animals present in all three. So, you know, that's very, very unmistakable. I mean, this character doesn't have wings in this one, but, you know. So there's something to that. There's definitely a lineage here that goes back to Paris in this deck. And I think that's just Dummett's main point, you know. So, and he actually says, you know, this deck, this pattern, shouldn't be called the Belgian Tarot. It should be called maybe the Paris-Rouen pattern, you know. Oh, sorry, took the full here. So you have Les Folles, both labeled 22, and yeah, so it's very, very interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some of the pips because they are important. I'm not going to show you all the pips, but I've separated some just to kind of give you to really show you the important ones. So again, in the Viville, you have all the titles of the trumps. In this one, in the Vandenborre and in the Vandenborre and the Hautot, okay, you have the card maker here on the Hautot, but you also have Cartes de Tres Fini fates or whatever. Okay, like Cartas de Tarot, Tres Finis, something like that. In the Vandenborre, you have Cartas de Suisse, which is interesting because that's sort of a nod to Swiss. Now, we don't know of any direct connection between Switzerland and the Belgium Tarot. And originally, this obviously isn't, that's an added feature because you see it here as Cartas Tarot, Tres Finis, and Adam C. Hautot. But it's interesting because who knows what happened. Maybe Belgium did get some things from Switzerland in terms of the game being played and culturally. Because I believe even Court de Gobelin in his book, mentions seeing Swiss ladies play the game. That's where he learned tarot. That's where he first saw tarot, from Swiss ladies. And it wasn't known in Paris, which of course isn't really true because, much earlier it was known in Paris. So now we have the 2. And in the Viville, you see the famous kind of S-shaped 2 of Pentacles we come to know. The Anonymous Tarot of Paris is very different, as usual. It's just, not... I mean, it's similar to these, but missing the S thing. And then again, you have Vandenborre and Hautot, and then you have that All Corroy, the trademark, which is how we've dated the deck now. And the 3 of Pentacles. Okay, so you have, like, in some of these, I think in the Viville you do see the cross in the Pentacle sometimes, but it's not throughout the entire thing. But for the most part, with these 3 you see, a lot of similarities. And with the Ace of Cups, now we see something that you see more in like the Gassman and even in the Swiss deck. So maybe this is where the Swiss influence comes in to. Maybe the Ace of Cups. I don't know if that's you see it in the Schaufhaus and some of the other decks. But in the Viville, it's much more classic Tarot de Marseille. Of course, the Tarot of Paris is just totally different. And these 2, they have the Ciborium, I think they're called, like with the cups with the lid that hold the communion. So, Okay, so now this is an interesting card here, is the 2 of Cups. And thing is, so in this 2 of Cups in the Viville, you do have the dragon heads, sort of, and then you have, more about the majors. The writing on these cards here, you do have the dragons. They've been turned into flowers in this one here. But you have written about the the rules of the game, It's about cups and coins. In the game of tarot, the cups and coins suit, the lower number cards, beat the higher number cards. They had more value in the game. So the lower numbers beat the higher numbers, and that's what it's about, basically. Okay, and some various other differences, but for the most part, these 3 are very, very similar. Similar Ace of Wands, except for the A-top, which is always different. The Viville and the Vandenborre are very close. This one's a bit different, And you still have and so in that respect they're similar, but then the Hautot has the droplets like the Viville, Okay, so now we're looking at the wands, and you can see these are very similar to these. They're very close to what we see even in the Tarot de Marseille, except they're slightly more rounded. In this one, they're just sticks. You have the number 3 added in this one. In the Vandenborre. In the Anonymous Tarot of Paris, you'll notice they have like B3. You know, it's like baton 3, which is kind of interesting. And this is probably the most different out of the aces. I mean, it's just, it looks a little bit different. The crown, the sword is through the crown here and partially through here, and here it's more at the top, and you know, it has the palms kind of crossing. So it's just so very interesting. I mean, you know what I mean? Okay, the two of swords, you have the little bird instead of the flower. Oh, no, I don't have a two of swords anywhere. Oh wait, I forgot to, had to catch up there. Okay. So you're getting the idea here. And then let's just take a look at some of the core cards here. For the most part, they're all very similar. You know, a couple little details here and there. They have the title here in the Vandenborre and in the background in the Hautot. And of course, as usual, there's no titles in the Veal. Okay, so the Chevalier. Missing the stick, but you can see here, this is something interesting. Okay, so in the Hautot, it looks like the stick is missing, and I don't know if that was like intentionally left out or what, but you can see the little knob there. You know what I mean? Like, you can see where it should have a stick, but it's just not complete. So I don't know if that was the engraver that did that or what. It's very possible the engraver just left it out, and it's just non-existent here. So you know, such cool deck. I mean, I'm in love with these decks. I really am. I'm so glad I had the opportunity to learn about them and, you know, read about them. I would love to hear from you guys if there's anything, you know, you heard that I said that, you know, maybe you have a different point of view. I would love to hear it, you know, because ultimately, you know, this is an ongoing thing. It's good to get the conversation going, and I will not be offended if you disagree with me. You know, I hope to encourage discussion. So please, if I miss something or if, you know, there's anything that you can add to this conversation, I would really appreciate that, you know. It's funny, I look at this Vivial Valet de Cups, you know. It reminds me of like a New Orleans kind of Mardi Gras figure for some reason, which obviously is French, you know, Mardi Gras. But it's just, it always reminds me of that. This one's very different, you know, in terms of very, very cool. Okay, so we have the King of Cups. Spelled Cavalier here, Chevalier in the Belgium deck, same as Paris. Really cool core cards. I don't know, man. I waver back and forth between the Vivial and the Hautot. I really love Shel David's Vivial because you can see everything very clearly, whereas in the you know, the facsimile, you can't really see what's going on. Shel did just a great job redoing the deck, and since that has happened, Vivial has really took off for me. But I love the Hautot too, and I'm very excited because I know Sullivan Hissman is doing another Belgium deck. I don't know which one, but I know it's a very significant historic deck, and I'm just really excited about that because I've become to really love his work. So, but anyway, I think that's good enough. You guys got a pretty good idea of the core cards and the pips. And I appreciate you watching. I hope you found this entertaining. And again, leave your comments below. And thanks again, guys. Until next time, love and peace. Bye-bye.